This is Jeffrey Madoff, and welcome to our podcast called Anything and Everything with my partner, Dan Sullivan.
How are you doing, Dan?
I'm very, very eager because we're going to undermine a myth today.
I love undermining myths. Yeah, despite some very highly publicized examples of young entrepreneurs, the research indicates that the average age of successful entrepreneurs is closer to middle age, somewhere between 40 to 45 years old. And there are more young entrepreneurs, young people attempting entrepreneurship than ever before. But there's also mitigating circumstances for that too that I think are quite interesting. So I'd like to start with just, I can't think of anybody better than you who is often in front of an audience of all entrepreneurs, and that's who you work with, and wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah. If I look at the record of entrepreneurs that we've had since mine goes back to 1974, so it's 51 years. If I just take everybody that I've personally dealt with in our program, we're about 25,000 that have been in Strategic Coach so far. I wouldn't be surprised if we averaged it out that the sweet spot for them is certainly in their early 40s. And one of the reasons for that is that I think that most of my experience is with males rather than females. So the vast majority of the entrepreneurs that I've personally coached and those who have been coached by other coaches in our program, there's a sorting out that I think individuals do, just quite frankly, in life. They sort themselves out between 30 and 40. And the real results of those who have had sort of a successful approach, a successful organizational structure, usually happens in their early 40s. And that's different when they actually start. When's the first time that you were in a situation where you're the one who had to create the money to pay for yourself, so that's really the point at which you become an entrepreneur. So I think it differs. I started at 30. You were younger, if I remember. Yeah. You were what, 25?
No, I was 21.
This would have been after university or during university?
The real entrepreneurial aspect was I had graduated.
Oh, okay.
And, was working in that store that one thing led to another.
Yeah.
I started a company.
Yeah.
But I was 21 there. I graduated early. Just as a sidebar, it was kind of funny because...
Was that because they wanted to get you through?
Let's get me out of there. Get him out.
I was trying to get who was most eager that you should leave university.
Me. Which I, for the most part, really liked. Mm-hmm. The University of Wisconsin in Madison. I had no idea what I was going to do.
No, of course not.
No concept of what I was going to do. But, the entrepreneurial background of my parents and the behavior that modeled for me is, I think, sort of set my destiny in motion that I wasn't going to be looking for a good job. I was going to be looking for a good opportunity to create jobs and create a business as a result. I always took the maximum number and actually got permission to take additional courses so I could finish. When I realized my junior year that I was really a semester away from graduating and I could graduate early, I, did that. So it was just because I took the courses I liked. I didn't care what the load was because I could always handle it. And then it ended up that I had accrued enough credits that I could graduate a semester early. So I did that. But I had the job of working in this store that started the whole thing while I was, in college. But that was kind of the platform.
So in relationship to the opening context here, that usually entrepreneurs are successful in their early 40s, how did that line up for you? Were you earlier there?
Well, that leads to another really interesting question, which is, well, what is success.
Hmm.
And how do you do it? Many entrepreneurs quantify success as getting to a certain financial point, a certain level of business that can be quantified and all of that. And it's funny, our book, Casting Not Hiring, in a way, when I've been talking to people about that and they've asked me about my career, I've said, I've actually been doing improv, since I left college. I didn't know I was going to be a designer. I didn't know that I was going to get into the film business. I didn't know that I was going to be, teaching on a college level. I didn't know I was going to be a playwright. So it's been improv based on truly what lights me up and the confidence that, whether ill-founded or not, the confidence that if I really wanted to do it, and it was something that really engaged me, I've never been able to get engaged by a deal. I'm engaged by the topic and how I have to spend my time. Hey, what about you on that? I mean, when you were starting out, because for me, it was always, oh, this really seems interesting. And I tried to figure out a way and was fortunately successful at how to make enough money to live to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, mine was mainly driven by a particular type of activity that I really loved doing. One is that it was conversational activity. And if I go right back to the beginning, which was 74, the activity itself actually started before I left the ad agency where I was working. And it was a set of circumstances that I was a new writer, and agencies are merger and acquisition creatures. You have an agency that before I joined them in 1971, they had probably gone through 5 or 6 mergers and acquisitions over a 15-year period. Okay. And what they're looking for are the big media buy clients. You grow your agency so that you have credibility that you can handle really big. We had Kraft. Kraft is a huge corporation. We had Chrysler. That's a huge corporation. And then we had one of the big Canadian banks, which are monstrous, like TD Bank. I mean, the smallest of the Canadian banks has 800 branches. So these are really, really big outfits. And of course, they're doing TV. If there's a way of promoting yourself, they're doing it. And there's a 17%, 17.5% take for all the media that you place. So they make their money on the big accounts. But along the way, they've accumulated a lot of little ragtag companies, which are personal relationship sort of clients. Somebody who's important in the agency has people that they're doing fee for service. And I was the fee for service writer because they weren't paying me anything. So they might as well put me on the accounts where they're not making any money. These are family businesses and would have been like your parents, would have been like your parents. They're doing advertising, but it's not media placement. It's just wherever they're doing their placement and whatever involves advertising for them. Well, then that's taken care of by writers. So I was the main writer for probably 10 companies, little companies. And it occurred to me that their problem wasn't advertising. Their problem was they didn't have any future. They didn't have a goal ahead of them that represented too much more than what they've already been doing. And a lot of them were getting to the point where there was going to be a generational change in the company. So they had never really given any thought that they would have a strategic plan for growing the business. And I was very interested to say, 3 years from now, where do you see yourself? And have a conversation around that. And then we would have, if you think about it, a flip chart size sheet of paper, I would do boxes and arrows and stars and everything else.
The early Dan Sullivan tools.
I was doing the Dan Sullivan routine. And, you tape them to a wall and you make sure that the magic marker didn't go through and mark up the wall. And I would just get them involved in a conversation. And that was my joy because that's what I'm doing today, 51 years later.
So, unlike me, I mean, your parents had a farm,
Hmm. Then a landscaping business.
so they were entrepreneurial also
Yep, yep, yep,
in a very different world.
yep.
What was it with you that made you think, well, this could be my business? Why didn't you continue to do advertising, ascend through the corporate levels? What turned the corner for you, and how old were you when you wanted to enter the world of entrepreneurship, and why?
Yeah, I would say 30. I would say 30 was, I liked advertising. I mean, I liked it, but first of all, you could tell that most of the hotshots in the advertising world, the people who were really doing well and knew they were doing new things, weren't very old. A lot of them were in their 20s and 30s. And I looked at the people who were in their 40s and 50s, and they weren't excited about what they were doing. I mean, they were making good money, but it wasn't exciting. The other thing, this was in Canada. And if you took a company like Kraft or you took a company like Chrysler, the two big US accounts, all the creative was being done in New York. And you were modifying it and adjusting it for Canadian use, but it wasn't real creative. They had some Canadian clients where they were doing really interesting things. And then, I began talking to people, and it was a lousy lifestyle. For one thing, advertising, it was feast and famine in terms of the work. You'd go for a week and you were just tidying up, and then you'd have a massive deadline. You were getting 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night, and kind of exciting. It was kind of exciting and everything else. But you could see doing that for decades of your life, you probably wouldn't end up very well. They were heavy smokers. They were heavy drinkers. I wasn't tending in that direction, but you could see why they did it.
Yeah, but what made you think, I could start my own business talking to business owners?
Yeah.
How'd that come about?
Well, it was actually the little companies that I was working with in the agency. They really liked the conversations. They had never had consultants working for them. They had never had anybody. And here, the advertising guy, the guy who was supposed to be writing the ads, and I did write the ads, was the person who was asking them the questions, not related to advertising, but, just why are you doing this anyway? Would you like the company to be better? Would you like the company to be more successful? Would you like to get into different markets? And I'd been in enough big meetings with the big accounts that I knew the type of questions but the copywriters and the advertising people are only looking for the thing that was solving the advertising issue. But it seemed to me it wasn't an advertising issue. It was a company issue. And it was an ownership issue, what they were trying to do. And I really liked that conversation. And then their accountant didn't ask them these questions. Their lawyer didn't ask them the questions. Yeah, so I just created this activity of asking questions and them being excited about the answer. So I had, 5 or 6 of them. And it occurred to me, I wasn't making much money in the agency. It occurred to me that if I wasn't in the agency and I was doing this, first of all, would it be possible? And then secondly, would these particular individuals be the first clients?
Did you immediately open an office and assume certain overhead?
No.
In the video company, my first client was Halston, the designer. And I would go to his incredibly luxe showroom, which was across the street from Saks Fifth Avenue at the Olympic Towers. Yeah, they had 18-foot windows all around looking out over the cityscape, and it was amazing. I'd be sitting there with Halston and say, I'm sorry, I've got to get to another appointment. I didn't have an office either. And so when I started out, I would always say, it happened to be in your neighborhood at that time. Why don't I just stop by your place? And I'd be meeting with Halston. This happened more than once. And oh, I've got to go. I've got another appointment I've got to get to. And, can we continue this later? What he didn't know was that that other meeting I had to get to was at the unemployment office. So I could collect my benefits. And that's what I did initially until I finally took some office space. But it was funny, some of the illusions we try to create in terms of our business. And, as you were saying, some of these companies in advertising, you had to prove that you were large enough to handle their business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sears wanted me to become part of their contemporary line of clothing for young men and women, and was at a meeting at the then rather new tallest building in the United States, Sears Tower in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I needed, literally, I would have had to have hired a few people just to manage their account. And I said to them, I can't afford to do business with you. The cost of doing business is just too high, because they want you to warehouse it, pick it and ship it when they want it, take all these returns. I mean, it's a whole business within a business just to support what was then kind of the Amazon of its time.
Sure.
Sears has everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's funny starting out. When did you feel financially safe enough to take on some overhead so you didn't have to do everything? Because that's a big problem that I think young entrepreneurs have. It's just
the one thing, if I go back then, this is 1974, I've never accumulated too much overhead. And it wasn't until we were successful that I actually ever had an office. The other thing that I think was interesting about it is that I made the break with the agency, and it wasn't acrimonious or not, because my boss, he was the creative director and he was the half owner of the agency. And he was a street kid from Detroit who, didn't go to college or anything. So he was out hustling on the street from his maybe mid-teenage years. And I think he totally got what was happening to me because it had happened to him. Except I think he was an entrepreneur. I mean, in the sense that he wasn't making any money unless he was selling something when he was in his late teenage years. So I think he had a real feel for someone who would be an entrepreneur. And the other thing is that I was lucky that I had developed kind of a methodology. It was sort of a way of going about asking people questions. And the people who really appreciated it weren't just so much the people who had products to sell. They were people who had services to sell, because services don't need warehouse space. And the other thing was that there was something happening in the economy, something that's happening in the marketplace that gave me a sense of what the future was going to be like. It was a series of articles in the New York Times, 1973. So I set out a year later, and he was talking about this new invention, which was called a microchip. And he was talking about, there was about 5 or 6 articles, technology writer for the Times. And what were microchips had been around for about 15 years, but they didn't have a name. And the name microchip started coming in the early 1970s. And he said, this is going to be the greatest invention so far. And the reason is because it can be applied to all the other inventions that already exist. Not only that, but as these microchips, and they had the progression, there was a history to these microchips as they got more powerful every 2 years. It's called Moore's Law, and, it still is a topic of discussion, and it's processing information. So right off the bat, there was a big picture that was emerging for me, that this invention called the microchip was going to have a profound impact on the marketplace. And the predictions of the writer is that big companies were going to have a hard time with this invention because it was going to speed up information. It was going to speed up change. It was going to speed up new challenges in the marketplace. And he said, I think what we're going to see is an explosion of entrepreneurism. But that never happened. This was 1974. That didn't really happen until 10 years later. That's when the personal computers came in. I think IBM was the first. I think it was 1979 when you had legitimately what a personal computer could be. It was a tough decade for me. I really earned my confidence by going through a very tough decade. 74 to 84 was really tough.
Because
Divorce, a couple bankruptcies. So I was married. I'd just been married in 1973. And if you could think of 5 characteristics of someone who would probably end up hating entrepreneurism, it was my wife. And then she personalized her hatred of entrepreneurism and focused it on me. And, what's called woke today, the whole concept of woke, she had that in 1975. It was business and it was capitalism and everything that was causing all the problems in the world. So the easiest part of my life for about 5 years was going out and getting rejected in the marketplace. The real trouble started when I went home at night.
the rejection continued.
The rejection, yeah. Anyway, so I had to go through that. And then I didn't really have a sense of the business model, and the big problem is while you're delivering the service that you get paid for, that's using up time that you needed to be out marketing. Yeah. So, it took me 10 years to get the model, but then I came up with what today is called a thinking tool. It was called a strategy circle. And first of all, I had it sort of conceptually. I could draw it on a sheet of paper, and then I got to the point where I could go to a printer and have the sheets printed out, and everybody went through the same. And interestingly enough, I was 42 when I had that breakthrough. And it was a sheet, and it was called a strategy circle. And first of all, you'd get people to establish a vision. I'd say, okay, we're going to go into the future, your choice of when the future is. And I'd say, is it a year out? And I found that you never wanted to go more than 3 years out. You would say, so on a day, this day, 3 years from now, what would be 5 bigger, better results for you than you have right now? And you'd write them down, you'd put numbers to them and everything. Okay. And then I'd say, okay, now tell me 10 reasons why that can't happen. And they would fill in little boxes, 10 reasons why that couldn't happen. And I says, now we're going to take each of the reasons why this can't happen, and we're going to create a strategy of overcoming the obstacle so that the breakthrough from the obstacle actually creates the result you want 3 years from now. And that was gangbusters. So that was 82 that I got that. And that was within a month of meeting Bab Smith. And she had a business. She was a top-notch therapeutic massage therapist. And she had a really interesting client base. She had air crews from the airlines. She had stunt people from the movies. I mean, really beat themselves up. And she had ballet dancers. And heavy stress of psychologically, emotionally heavy stress, airline crews, stuntmen, severe damage to their bodies, and ballet dancers, which is, kind of one of the dumbest things that you can do to your physical frame. And she got a reputation, but she had been at it for about 5-6 years, and she was getting tired of it. And I just met her. We were friends, for 6 months, a year, we were friends. And I had actually used her for massage. And I told her about my strategy circle idea. And she said, could you do that with my business? And I said, sure. I said, couple hours. And we did, and we talked it through, and I drew it out for a big sheet of paper. And when she got finished, planning session, she said, this is going to be really big. And I said, your business? She said, no, what you're doing is going to be really big. She said, I got all sorts of friends. I need this, what you're doing. And some of them did, some of them didn't. But I had really, by that point, developed enough of a reputation with the right number of people who were in networks of entrepreneurs that the word went out. And when I formalized it more and more, and I said, this is the way it works. I have a method. And this was the right time, the 1980s, to have a method. So it was a structure, a thinking structure. And I didn't have to know anything about their business. The only thing I had to know was that this is someone who could visualize the future for themselves and would honestly answer the questions that I would ask. And then I would document it. And then, I had typists and you could take it to a blueprint shop where they do architectural drawings, and they could take the drawing and they could formalize it and you could give it back to them. The other thing that was a real breakthrough for me is that my two bankruptcies, I had one in 78 and I had one around 82, they were because of receivables.
Oh, so they were
Receivables. I was supposed to get paid a month after I did the work. It was 2 months after the work, and I was too close to the cliff, and I went under. So I made a rule in 1984, everything's up front. All the money's up front or I don't start. And that's been that way it's been that way now for 40 years. All the money's up front. You never have a receivable. For an entrepreneur, life gets really simple if you don't have receivables.
You don't have to chase them on it.
Yeah.
Were your first clients people that you had met through your previous employment?
No. I mean, my reputation at that point was that I was part of the agency. Once I wasn't part of the agency. First of all, they weren't being charged for it. The agency just said it's a service that we can provide to them. Then you had to work out pricing. Pricing is a real talent. Knowing how to price is a real talent.
Well, and the reason I asked that question is that by the time you started, when you were saying you were 42.
I started at 30.
Right. You started at 30.
I was 42 when I had the breakthrough.
Right. And, one of the things that, the stories of young entrepreneurs, of a Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, that sort of thing, that makes great copy and great story and also a lot of mythology and everything else. But in your case, one of the things that happened was that you had gained experience, you had started building a network, you knew how to talk to people, which my guess is none of those skills were that finely honed when you were in your early 20s in working. And so one of the advantages of age is you've got a certain foundation, both in contacts and so on, and experience that I think is a huge help.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that so much of the mythology of entrepreneurship has to do with focusing on those young success stories, which are by far the exception, not the rule.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the one, you're not talking about the other 9,999 that didn't make it.
Exactly. And I think that one of the reasons that the numbers of people at least trying to be entrepreneurs, I think that COVID was a real turning point for a lot of people because they found themselves at home. Many found themselves out of jobs. And the question was, what can I do? What can I do? And I think that it became almost a necessity to try to do something on your own because there didn't seem to be the same kind of opportunities that there had been. And, most Americans don't have that much money in the bank to withstand, what is the average? Can't even meet a month's rent or something like that. I mean, it's tough for people. And so I think that there were a whole lot of attempts, not necessarily successful, because it didn't change the average age where entrepreneurs become successful. Mm-hmm. Again, it's very, very, very few that do that when they're in their early 20s.
Yeah.
And especially to that level,
mm-hmm.
To the level that some of those businesses went. And how much better equipped did you find yourself to be when you started out in your 30s and by the time you had the breakthrough? What would you say was what was the essence of the breakthrough that showed you there's a real future here? This is what I'm going to be doing.
Well, I don't think that there was any alternative. Like one thing that got me through the tough period is that it was only a question of when, it wasn't a question of if.
Right.
I have a fair amount of personal confidence that whatever it takes to go through the learning stage to understand what a success model looks like. I'm going to do it.
Did that confidence come from, you were coming off a divorce, you were coming off of 2 bankruptcies? That's usually not the strongest foundation for self-esteem. What was it with you that made you think, but I can do this?
Yeah, I had a picture in my mind of what it would look like when it was successful. When it was successful, I had a picture. And, one is I think I'm really tough. I'm a really tough character. There's actually quite a bit of forgiveness, and the divorce and the first bankruptcy happened almost simultaneously. So I got to figure out how to say this. I can remember having hardly any money. I had enough money for rent and everything else. And I said, if I can get through this, this is going to be the toughest part of my life, and it'll be behind me. It'll be behind me. And the other thing is the world was changing, Jeff. I mean, a lot of people don't realize they're talking about AI today, but things were shifting enormously in the late 70s. There was an enormous amount of shift going on. And the excitement about new technologies, especially microchip. The only question is, could you get them into a small enough package that would be inexpensive enough that a large number of people could actually use them? That was a tough period. That was the inflation period, the huge inflation period. Now, I don't remember ever getting to the point where you may just have to have a job for the rest of your life. You may have to just go and do it. It never occurred to me that that would be an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I will say this, because we're talking about the, successful entrepreneurs. I haven't found one yet that doesn't have that in their background.
That doesn't have what in the background?
The rough periods.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a story of Bill Gates. I think he grew up in Seattle, but I think that when he started creating what became Microsoft, I think he was in Texas. I think he was he had kind of like an industrial building. They were behind in the rent. And, his dad's a millionaire, so I'm sure, he had money that he needed, a certain amount of it. And he went to the landlord and said, would you take stocks in the company instead of the rent? And the guy said, oh, I know you guys know. He said, I can tell. No. He says, I want the cash. He would have been better to take stocks. So, Jeff, it's all guesses and bets.
Well, true.
Yep.
True. Those stories, just like the guy that painted the offices at Facebook and got stock, who knew? It's almost like winning the lottery, probably in terms of the odds.
Yeah. I'll tell you something on the investment. You talk about the entrepreneurial side, 1 out of 10,000. It's true on the investor side, too.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's,
My first IP lawyer, great guy from Silicon Valley, John Farrell, he only dealt with startups. His entire business was startups. He would do the IP for startups. And as part of that, he could get stock as part of the deal. They had to pay money, but he could also get stock.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked him one day, I said, right now, how many companies, startup companies, do you have stock in? He says, about 70. He says, usually around 70. And I said, how many of them have to really make it for it to be worthwhile? And he said, 3. He says, that's pretty much the odds of how many of them. And I mean that. Can they pay their bills? Yeah, but that's not the breakthrough they're looking for. They're looking for the big breakthrough. And he said, yeah. And he had Facebook as one of them.
Yeah, and there have been people that have been good pickers,
Mm-hmm.
In terms of that, but I'm sure
And you get better as you go along.
And I'm sure that among those who are and they also get involved when it's more de-risked too.
Also, they have much more advisory control in the early days, too.
Yeah, and I think that, again, all of these things belie the fact that those sort of connections, that kind of experience and knowledge that can help and inform your decision-making, usually comes at a later stage in life, not right out of college,
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting.
Can I ask you a question? Because we're talking about my tough period here. And I would say that easily there was a 5 or 6 year period of my life where my sticking with it defied logic.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what would you say is the makeup of a person who will go through long periods where what they're doing is defying logic?
Commitment to an idea, and probably obsession with realizing that idea.
Yep. Yeah.
Because if you don't have that obsession and you don't have that commitment, I think the chances of making it are extremely slim to non-existent.
Yeah. And they have to have some sort of talent too.
Yeah, but sometimes that talent is manifest through the perseverance that they have. I don't know if it's a talent, but the ability to persevere when all is telling you no. And I think that perseverance is really essential.
Yep.
And I was at this event the other night on Friday night, and coincidence held at different people's homes. And it's very cool. I met a lot of amazing people. This happened to be held at the home of the woman who was the CEO of Soho Repertory Theater. And so there were a few of the guests that were there that were producers. One of them was a woman, Eva Price. She and I met probably in 2017. And she was interested in GMing, being a general manager of personality. She's very bright. I really liked her. And she was, at that point, not what she is now, which is a Tony Award-winning, Grammy Award-winning lead producer. And it was funny because I hadn't seen her for a few years. And we look at each other, do a double take, and hug each other. And it's great to see. And she says, I was just talking with someone about you 2 days ago. I was in London. And I said, who are you? She said, I'm trying to remember who it was. I said, Simon Woolley? Yes. And I said, he's my general manager in London. Says, yeah, and I was so happy to hear that personality is alive and well and doing this. I think that's so great. And I said, well, you have done such an extraordinary job. I met you pretty early in your career, and now the success that you've achieved is incredible. And she said, well, thank you. And I said, takes some perseverance, doesn't it? And she laughed and said, oh, yeah, that's the main thing. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how hard it is. I think that there's a misconception because so many people bullshit about this stuff, And so anyhow, it was interesting because we both had traveled this path and we're still on it after all that time.
Yeah.
I mean, don't you find that a lot of people are reluctant to admit that they've had a hard time, that there have been difficult stretches?
Yeah. I think it has to do, what do you do with difficulty? I mean, I think there's a creative process that can be related to things are difficult. So how do we deal with difficulty as if it's just part of the process?
Because it is.
Well, I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where relationships come in, where there are people that their only agenda is, and I'm fortunate to have people like this in my life, their only agenda is, as mine is with people that I try to help, is, if nothing else, being a sounding board or something that can be helpful, because I think that it can be a lonely place. And I think there's a lot of people that feel that they aren't accepted unless they've achieved what to others is a tangible success. I mean,
yeah. Has that ever played a big part of your thinking?
No.
No, hasn't mine either.
Yeah. Why is that, do you think?
Well, because I think it's an internal matter right from the beginning, that you're having a conversation with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Status really doesn't play much of my thing. Like, I've never belonged to entrepreneurial groups. And what I say by that, I'll give an example of a group that I do play, and that's Joe Polish with Genius Network. And the reason, I'm, how many years now? I'm 14 years that I've been a member of Joe's group. One of it is because I really enjoy the relationship with Joe. Because two more radically different people you can't imagine. We're doing an Audible project for Hay House. And this is not a book. It's just two people. Each of us has sort of a theme we're working on. And then part of the Audible is you get together and talk about what each of you talk to and what does it have in common. It's about a 4 or 5 hour finished project. And part of Joe's is just the horrible childhood that he had. I mean, this is public knowledge and it's published, like mother dies at 4, father falls apart every 2 years, moves him someplace different, gets in with bad people, gets abused, gets taken advantage of, shy, introverted, gets into drugs, everything. And then I said, I've listened to hundreds of people tell their story, and I have to tell you, I had the happiest childhood you can possibly imagine. I said, I had 2 parents. I was a 5th child. My parents were both 5th children. It was just seamless. We just got along. I had a lot of conversation with my parents, got taken along with them when they were doing things, was useful. I learned how to be useful. And I said, I can't think of a single thing from my childhood that is negative that in any way has affected me as I've gotten older. Not true for my siblings. I have 6 siblings. Not true for them, but true for me. And so Joe told his story. I told my story. And I said, what it shows you, and Joe, you're a talented, successful, ambitious entrepreneur, and I'm a talented, successful, ambitious entrepreneur. So it just shows you have your choice of what kind of childhood you want to have before you become a talented, successful entrepreneur. You had a miserable childhood, and here's what has happened to you. I had a happy childhood, and this is what's happened to me. So if you're going to be a talented, successful, ambitious entrepreneur, you have your choice about what kind of childhood you'd like to have.
Yeah, I think that people say, well, you work with these models and you work with actors, and aren't they just crazy? Aren't they difficult people to deal with? And the answer is no more than the general population. I'm sure if you went to some large insurance office, you'd have people that had addiction issues, bad relationships, et cetera, and it's just that you don't know who they are. But if there's a famous name associated with it, a lot of people are very, like the salaciousness of hearing about people who have hit the wall in what appeared to be an otherwise privileged life.
Yeah.
And I think that, so I was being interviewed and somebody said, well, so doesn't creativity though really come from a positive place? Not necessarily. You can have a miserable life. Van Gogh didn't have a great life, but the pain and exclusion that he felt made his paintings, like Egon Schiele, made their paintings incredibly expressive and personal. And that was a result of difficult times. And there are other people that didn't have difficult times, and they did really wonderful things. Yeah. And I don't think there's any one input that determines an output. I think it gets to be that black box that airplanes have. We sort of all have it up in here someplace.
Yeah, I think that, what it reminds me, that I don't think you can train someone to be an entrepreneur, okay, if they don't have the commitment, obsession, and perseverance.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
But that would be true of baseball players. That would be true of painters. That would be true of investment bankers. That would be true of anybody. I do think there's a liking for a certain type of activity where you're directly relating to the marketplace that does make an entrepreneur. Most people don't want to have a direct relationship with the marketplace.
Well, I think most people don't want to expose themselves to pain or hurt.
Rejection.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Which is inevitably going to happen.
Well, if rejection is not a learning experience for you, you're going to try to avoid it.
That's right. Or numb yourself to it.
Yeah. I find rejection an interesting experience.
Yeah. I mean, nobody likes it. But I think that, can you learn from it? Yeah. And sometimes you can also learn what to avoid.
Which happens when you get to between 40 and 45.
That's right. I mean, hopefully we've gained some wisdom, during that period of time. So I agree with you. But I think that there is a tendency among people to want to really categorize things and make it a neat little box of if you do X, Y is the result. And if I'm trying to sell you on some kind of a program, my job is to convince you that if you buy what I'm selling, it will have the desired effect that you want.
Mm-hmm.
And, you not joining any entrepreneurial groups, it kind of reminds me of the Groucho Marx's statement, which I feel the same about myself. I'd never join a club that would have me as a member.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's interesting because I think that entrepreneurship, there are those characteristics, as we've talked about, perseverance and the ability to deal with rejection without it destroying you. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. And you always learn from rejection or failure? No.
Mm-hmm.
Other than sometimes you learn how to avoid it. And sometimes that learning how to avoid it has to do with how to think smarter about what it is you're doing. So you, as they say, you don't make the same mistake twice.
Mm-hmm. The big thing that hasn't changed since 1974, because I checked it then and I check it 5 or 6 times, and the actual percentage of people making their living through entrepreneurship was 5% in 74. It's 5% today.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's 5%.
It's just 5% of a larger number.
Yeah, 5% of a larger number. So there are more of them, but their percentage is not higher.
Yes, the delusion.
I think the reason is that the general economy doesn't need more than 5 new things to keep the system going.
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting proposition.
I mean, it's it's a weird thing, but when there's a certain number of people, one of them's going to be a genius and one of them's going to be an idiot, it's relative to each other. So my sense is that to have a certain number of consumers, if you have a certain number of consumers who are buying new things, you only need a certain percentage of people who are creating new things.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then there's all the people who are what I would say social entrepreneurs, status entrepreneurs. They're kind of entrepreneurs, but it's mostly for social and status purposes. They're not really entrepreneurs.
Or they were fortunate enough to be born into enough money that they can kind of appear to be entrepreneurial, but they don't have to think about the same things.
Yeah, you can be a millionaire today if you inherited 10 million back then.
That's right. That's right.
If you haven't spent it all.
Thanks for joining us today on our show, Anything and Everything. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. For more about me and my work, visit acreativecareer.com and madoffproductions.com. To learn more about Dan and Strategic Coach, visit strategiccoach.com.